So, I'm going to be talking in this video about a topic that's been on my mind for a while. It's sort of a theory that I've been contemplating over in my head for quite a while. And to be honest, it's still a bit rough around the edges. I haven't really ironed out all the details of it, but as a framework for understanding a lot about politics and people, like people who I know and just people in general, as well as like metapolitics and stuff like that, I think it's actually a very important framework. And I think what this framework is essentially the distinction between serotonin and dopamine and how they relate to people's behavior. Essentially, my hypothesis is that basically, if you look at dopamine and serotonin, these are two different chemicals in the human brain that regulate behavior. And I really think there's two different types of people. Like there's dopamine driven people and serotonin driven people. And I think these chemicals go a long way in explaining people's behavior as well as political leanings. Now, basically, for those who don't know, like I'm no neuroscientist, so I'm probably gonna butcher this whole explanation, but dopamine is essentially a chemical that is linked toward sensory experiences. Basically, as Eli Harmon put it in one of his videos, sensation seeking. And I think people who are dopamine driven are really driven towards sensation seeking behavior. Now, that could come in a number of ways. It could come with drugs, alcohol, sex, porn, um, going to nightclubs, dancing, pursuing like extreme sports and stuff like that. We're not even necessarily extreme, but like, hiking even or mountain biking, canoeing, kayaking, what have you. Uh, Also just like travel, for instance, like going to places of natural beauty or architectural beauty, enjoying like artwork, like paintings, sculpture, watching movies, TV shows. Although I think sometimes certain media, like movies and TV, can also be linked to serotonin, as I'll explain later. But I think, like, say for instance, movies that have a lot of action, or are very visually stimulating, like a movie like Transformers on one hand, but also a movie like Blade Runner 2049 on the other hand. Um, or something like Breaking Bad, for instance, could also be like that. Like something that's very intense. Those kinds of things are what people with dopamine driven people are into. So they're very much like sensation seeking people. This can be good or bad because it can lead to, on one hand, degeneracy like drugs, drug addiction, sex addiction, just that kind of behavior. But on the other hand, I think certain dopamine driven people, not all, but I think driven people tend to have more of an appreciation of things like art or music. They care more about things like architecture, nature, hiking, traveling, etc. So I do think they have more of an appreciation for certain things like that. Now, on the other hand, serotonin driven people, they're more conservative, not necessarily in a political sense, but in a behavioral sense. They're very much driven by work and family. That's kind of their motto. Work, family, and home is kind of what drives them. They're often homebodies. They prefer being at home unless they're at work, unless they work at home, and many of them probably like working from home. They like spending time with their family and I guess friends also. They're very much homebodies or community bodies. Like they tend to like stay within their own town or their own community quite a lot. Now, when they do also like movies and TV shows, but I find they have a different type of preference. Like they often like say like sitcoms and stuff like that. They like shows where it's not necessarily about the visuals or the intensity, but rather about like seeing the same familiar characters on a day-to-day basis. So they might really like a show like say Friends or The Big Bang Theory or Seinfeld or something like that. Like they might gravitate toward those types of shows, whereas a dopamine driven person might gravitate more toward a show like 24 or Breaking Bad or Prison Break or something like that. Or like Game of Thrones, that would be a show a dopamine driven person would more gravitate toward. So you can kind of see this dichotomy here. Like serotonin driven people, they're very home oriented, family oriented, and work oriented. Whereas dopamine driven people are more oriented around sensation seeking, which can be, again, for better or worse. Now, if you're interested, if you know about the Myers-Briggs test, I think dopamine driven people tend to be uh, uh, the letter P, perceiving, whereas serotonin driven people tend to be more the letter J, judging. So it kind of relates to that also. And it also relates to a number of things. Like I think serotonin people driven people, as I said, tend to be more conservative, and dopamine driven people tend to be more liberal. However, that's not always the case. There are many exceptions to this rule. I've met many serotonin driven liberals and many dopamine driven conservatives. What's interesting is that there's sometimes a bit of an apparent contradiction between their behavior and their beliefs. Like a lot of serotonin driven liberals are basically like homebodies who either they're family oriented or they might be very pet oriented. That's another thing. Like not all serotonin driven people have children, but some of them, if they don't have children, they're often very, very fixated on their pets as substitutes for children. So they're very home oriented, like cat ladies, for instance. Like if you want an example of the dichotomy between dopamine and serotonin, a dopamine driven girl would be the type of girl who goes to nightclubs and parties all the time. A serotonin driven girl would be like your typical cat lady. So again, like this idea that serotonin driven people are more politically conservative, it's not always the case, because with the cat lady archetype, you have a certain type of person who is serotonin driven, but at the same time tends to have more liberal political views. However, again, like how they manifest these views in their behavior is very different. Like a serotonin driven liberal will support the rights of gay people to have their standard fuck parties, but they themselves would never in a million years dream of going to a standard fuck party, or even for that matter, a regular nightclub. So that's kind of, again, the difference between serotonin driven and dopamine driven people. And it does not always align with political views, even though I think there is a correlation. And actually, lately, I find we're seeing more serotonin-driven liberals than ever before, which is why I think it's partly because serotonin-driven people often tend to be sort of conformist. They kind of have the attitude often, keep calm and carry on. Like they're those kinds of people. Like I just want to grill, those types. And increasingly, as the political norm shifts to the left, like the Overton window shifts in a more liberal direction, those types of people are just adopting more liberal views because that is increasingly just the status quo. And when you do get serotonin-driven people on the right, a lot of them are the types of people who are like, I just want the 1950s back. I miss when streets were safe. Why can't I just grill in peace? Like those kinds of sentiments are more the serotonin-driven right-winger, whereas the dopamine-driven right-wingers are the types of people like me. Like I'm a very, very dopamine-driven person. So they're the types of people like me who are all like, I want more beautiful architecture. Why can we not create these things anymore? That would be, or for instance, complaining like, oh, every time I go to these beautiful old neighborhoods, they're dangerous because they're getting overrun with crackheads and such. Like those would be the types of things that a dopamine driven right winger would say. Whereas a serotonin driven right winger, I find serotonin driven people have a preference for small towns, rural areas, and suburbs, whereas dopamine driven people have a preference more for cities or for places that are denser, like maybe not a big city per se, but a place like, say, Toledo, Spain, or Girona in Spain, like towns that are like smaller cities that are like denser and have more of that kind of urban feel, even if they're not like big cities, if you know what I mean. Dopamine driven people also like national parks. They like mountains, canyons, waterfalls, like majestic nature. Whereas I find serotonin driven people, they often prefer more subdued. Like if they do have any kind of appreciation for beauty, like in my opinion, dopamine people are more inherently driven toward physical beauty because it gives them a certain rush in their head that they just crave. And that's why, all these people who are like hiking addicts, those are very, very dopamine driven people, or like travel addicts who like going to historic cities in Europe or wherever. They're very dopamine driven, or also like wanting to get new cultural experiences, like craving novelty as well. But serotonin driven people, I think, insofar as they do appreciate beauty, which I think a lot of them frankly don't, but insofar as they do, I find they're more into a more subdued type of beauty. Like they like things like, say, rolling hills as opposed to mountains, for instance, or like kind of like the pastoral type, like the Shire, or like kind of that type of specific place. Like I find, yeah, they're more into like the subdued type of beauty. They're not as much into like mountains and, big historic cities like Prague or Florence or what have you. They're more into like subdued type landscapes, like sort of the English countryside, that sort of thing. Um, but a lot of serotonin driven people don't seem to have much really of a desire to travel at all. Um, a lot of them, they just want to stay in their hometown. They really don't have much of an ambition to see the world, or even other places in their own country or continent. It's kind of how they are, is just they're very much they're very home oriented and community oriented, like oriented in their own community, and they don't have much of a desire to explore elsewhere. It's very much, again, like I think the Puritan mentality kind of comes from a very serotonin driven mentality, because a lot of them really have this attitude, life is only about essentially working and reproducing. And anything else is a distraction from that. Anything else is sinful, it's degenerate, or it's wasteful. Like, again, you have your left wing and right wing Puritans. The right wing Puritans, like, again, I think Puritanism in general is a very, very serotonin driven ideology. Or it could be people who are dopamine driven, but who feel they've gone too far and are trying to like correct themselves by embracing this worldview that is essentially the opposite of their own nature. But I think in most cases it is serotonin driven people who believe in Puritanism. And again, there's multiple forms of Puritanism. Puritanism is basically the ideology that anything fun is bad, anything enjoyable is bad, and life is entirely about work, possibly about reproduction, depending on what type of Puritan you are. But it's about work and it's about sacrifice. That these are the things they believe in. They don't believe in enjoyment, recreation, fun, beauty, any of those types of things. The issue is that type of mentality can be very dangerous, because in its more extreme circumstances, it can lead to what we saw during the Dutch Reformation, where they were actually painting over the artwork inside churches because they believed that church artwork was sinful and a distraction from God. I think that is like the more extreme manifestation of Puritanism. But we see, again, Puritanism on the left and the right. And left-wing Puritanism, a lot of the COVID lockdown advocates, I think, are left-wing Puritans. They're very, very strongly opposed to anything that you enjoy that could possibly spread COVID, whether it be travel or partying or whatever. And that's just the thing I think is driving some dopamine-driven people away from the left, is how puritanical the left is becoming lately, and telling them, no, you can't have fun. Like, you can't travel because it spreads COVID. You can't party because it spreads COVID. And the same is true with environmentalism. I mean, again, environmentalism, I do think global warming is a real thing, but I also think that there are many people within the environmentalist movement who have a Puritan ideology. And their idea is that, like, anything fun is bad for the environment. And they tend to focus more on certain things, too. Like, these types of people, they don't focus much on SUVs or pickup trucks or suburbia. They focus entirely on travel and eating meat. And I think it's because tourism and eating meat are two things that dopamine driven people love, whereas serotonin driven people are more like work and family focused. They're not sensation focused. So to them, it's something like, oh, I want a big vehicle for practical reasons. Like they convince themselves they need an SUV for taking their family around and hauling their shit around. They need a great big polluting vehicle, or they need a great big house. That's the thing. Serotonin driven people, they do have certain luxuries that they love. They're not devoid of indulgence altogether. And the things they do spend money on, they are luxurious with, is their homes and their cars. And also anything to do with their pets. As I said, they're very home-oriented people. So I'm not trying to imply that like serotonin-driven people are entirely like frugal. Like when I say that they're Puritan, I don't necessarily mean that they're frugal with money in every single way. I think it's more an ideology. It's the homesteading mentality. It's very much like that. So yeah, as I'm trying to explain, like there's left-wing Puritans and right-wing Puritans. Like the right-wing Puritans are obvious, like the people you see spreading the soy jack memes, basically saying that anything fun, if you enjoy anything, you're a soy boy. Like, I mean, I could practically see them spreading soy jack memes with like people enjoying church artwork as justification for what the Reformation did, like the soy face and the pointing at the beautiful church artwork, like, oh, like that's my issue with the soy jack memes, is they can be hilarious, but at the same time, they sort of imply that anything enjoyable is bad. And I don't like where that mentality leads. So, yeah, again, like, I mean, you could show somebody who's, like, hiking on a mountain trail with the soy jack face. Like, oh, look at the beautiful mountains. Oh. And again, like, it's the implication that anything enjoyable is bad. That's kind of Puritanism where it stems from. Like, if you're not working, if you're not raising family, if you're not raising your pets, anything that's just sensation seeking where you're enjoying something for yourself is inherently bad. That's kind of the Puritan ethos. And it's, again, as I say, it relates to basically serotonin driven people. But again, like there's perils to being dopamine driven too. Like dopamine driven people are more likely to become addicted to various things. Not necessarily just drugs, but addicted to experiences too, like travel addiction. I'm kind of a travel addict, to be honest. I mean, the thing is, as I said, dopamine-driven people are more believe in the credo of experiences, not things, whereas serotonin-driven people are more believe in things, not experiences. They consider themselves very practical. They're all about like their possessions accumulating value, accumulating wealth, things that have material value. Whereas dopamine-driven people are more about experiences. And I feel like with the COVID lockdown, all of society is kind of being forced to adopt a more serotonin-driven mindset. Because almost everything dopamine-driven has been made either illegal or you have to jump through a million hoops to do it because of the COVID lockdown. So I don't know, like, are people malleable in that regard? Maybe to some extent, people will go with the flow. So like a dopamine-driven person will adopt a more serotonin-driven mindset to some extent in response to their situation and vice versa. But I kind of feel that those people who fluctuate are the ones who are kind of in the middle to begin with. Whereas like someone like me, you're never going to turn me into a serotonin-driven person. It's just not who I am, no matter how many lockdowns you impose. And I think that's partly why some people during the lockdown are really turning toward drugs and alcohol. Sales of weed and booze have skyrocketed. And I think it's because in many cases for dopamine-driven people, that's the only new dopamine rush they have. They don't even have as many movies and TV shows anymore because production has been stalled on so many, or they're just not releasing them because of the COVID lockdown. So again, like all they have is booze and weed. It's kind of sad. I mean, yes, you can still travel, but there's so many hoops to jump through. And in some cases, you can't. Like in some cases, you'll be rejected at the border, or there's the risk you'll be rejected at the border. So it's a huge pain in the ass. So anyway, I'm getting a bit overlong here. So I guess to wrap it up, my point is, I think a lot of the differences between people can be explained through the distinction between serotonin and dopamine, both in terms of their political lives and their social lives.